Novak Djokovic. Why was his visa cancelled and what happens next? Why is Novak Djokovic in this position? To fully explain the background behind one of the most extraordinary dramas involving a sports star in recent memory, we must first go back to April 2020. Shortly after the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, Djokovic casually and briefly aired his views on vaccines during a Sunday evening chat on Facebook Live with his fellow Serbian players. "I am opposed to vaccination and I wouldn't want to be forced by someone to take a vaccine in order to be able to travel," Djokovic said. "But if it becomes compulsory, what will happen? I will have to make a decision." Djokovic never publicly disclosed his vaccination status after this. What was required to compete in the Australian Open? On November 20, 2021, Australian Open organisers confirmed what had long been suspected, that all players, coaches, staff and spectators on site at Melbourne Park had to be fully vaccinated against COVID-19. When we are in a state where more than 90% of the population are fully vaccinated and have done a magnificent job with it, it's the right thing to do, Craig Tiley, the tournament director, said. Immediately this raised uncertainty over the participation of Djokovic, who refused later that day to commit to entering the tournament. "We'll have to wait and see," he said. Soon after, players were informed by organisers that they could apply for an exemption from a COVID-19 vaccine should they have a valid medical reason. What does a medical exemption involve? An application for an exemption is assessed in Australia by two separate panels of independent experts from the fields of immunology, infectious disease, cardiology and sports medicine. The final decision is made by the second panel, appointed by the local Victorian government. The personal information of an applicant is redacted to ensure anonymity. Grounds for this include an inflammatory cardiac illness within the past 3 months and an acute major medical condition. But it is understood that Djokovic used the clause that allows someone recently infected with COVID-19 to defer vaccination for up to 6 months. Earlier this week his application was approved and he commenced his journey from Europe to Australia on Tuesday morning. Why was Djokovic then stopped at the border? While Djokovic was on a 14-hour commercial flight from Dubai to Melbourne, the Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison warned that he must prove upon arrival that he cannot be vaccinated for medical reasons or he would be put on the next plane home. It also emerged that the Australian Border Force was investigating an issue with Djokovic's visa. Djokovic landed at Tullamarine Airport at 11:15 p.m. yesterday and was denied immediate entry to the country at passport control because of a problem with the paperwork supporting his exemption. He was held in a room under police guard for more than 8 hours before being informed that his visa was cancelled because he had failed to provide appropriate evidence. He was issued with a letter of deportation, but his lawyers immediately appealed the decision using a federal injunction. Some clarity was offered later by Morrison, who said that Djokovic's exemption to play in the Australian Open was not also an automatic exemption from rules at the federal border. He appeared to blame tournament organisers for failing to make it clear that unvaccinated travellers from overseas could not gain entry. What happens now? Djokovic has earned a reprieve of sorts. Rather than taking the first possible flight back to Europe, he was transferred to an immigration hotel for asylum seekers in the Melbourne area while his lawyers sought to overturn the decision. At a brief court hearing today, a judge granted an interim injunction that delays deportation until Monday at the earliest, when a full hearing will take place to determine his fate. And will he face the same problem at other tournaments? In certain places, yes. His defense of the French Open in May looks particularly at risk. These are the present travel restrictions for unvaccinated people in the country of each Masters and Grand Slam event between the Australian Open and Wimbledon. United States. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention website says, "You must be fully vaccinated to travel to the United States by plane if you are a non-US citizen, non-US immigrant." There is a list of exceptions, which excludes elite sports people, but persons whose entry would be in the national interest, as determined by the Secretary of State, Secretary of Transportation, or Secretary of Homeland Security could provide a potential loophole. Monaco, as long as travelers are arriving from the Green Zone, a long list of countries including the EU, they do not require a vaccination. Proof of recent recovery from COVID or a negative PCR test will suffice. However, a negative test result would not be enough to permit Djokovic to travel directly from Serbia, which is in Monaco's red zone. Spain entry is restricted from non-EU countries, but there is an exception for highly qualified workers whose work is necessary and cannot be postponed or carried out remotely, including participants in high-level sports events that take place in Spain. Proof of vaccination or recovery certificate is only required if you travel from a high-risk country, which is a small list of African nations. Italy, no vaccination required to enter, but those without jabs must test before traveling, self-isolate for 5 days under medical supervision and test again at the end of the isolation period. France, unvaccinated arrivals from countries on the French amber or red lists will only be permitted to travel for essential reasons. High-level sport events do not appear on the list, and must self-isolate for 7 or 10 days. Djokovic could, however, enter France from an EU country, as they are on the green list, with a negative test. Serbia is on the red list at present. Whether or not he will then be able to compete at Roland Garros is another matter. From January 15th, sportspeople at all levels in France will need to be double vaccinated. At present there is no exemption for elite athletes, and President Macron recently vowed to piss off the unvaccinated.